The storm was raging outside, rain pounding against the windows, and the wind howling through every crack of the house. I never thought a simple visit to Auntie's place would trap me in such an unexpected moment. Power went out, darkness spread through the rooms, and that's when I realized, it wasn't just me here. Auntie's friend was stuck too. The silence between us grew heavier than the storm outside, and in that silence, something began to change. The rain had started as a gentle drizzle in the afternoon, nothing more than a soft tapping against the window panes while I helped Auntie clear the dining table after lunch. But by the time the evening came, the sky had turned dark and swollen with heavy clouds, and the drizzle had become a fierce downpour that seemed determined to drown everything outside. Auntie had gone to her room, already complaining about her knees hurting when it rained, and left me in the living room to watch the storm as it grew angrier. I didn't think much of it at first. Storms came and went all the time in this town, but I soon realized this one was different when I noticed the sharp whistles of the wind crawling through the narrow spaces of the old house. I wrapped my arms around myself, the cold setting in quickly, and wondered how long it would last. That was when I heard the knock. At first it was faint, almost drowned out by the storm, but then it came again, louder, urgent. I hesitated, but eventually I went to the door, tugging it open against the heavy push of the wind. Standing there, dripping wet with her coat clinging to her like a second skin, was Auntie's friend. I had seen her before, but never like this, hair plastered to her face, cheeks flushed from the cold, and eyes filled with relief when she saw me. She smiled even while shivering, and quickly stepped inside when I pulled the door wide. Her name slipped from my lips, a little hesitant, as I remembered the polite introductions from the last family gathering. She laughed softly, shaking the rain from her sleeves, and told me she hadn't expected to get caught in such a storm. The house groaned as the wind picked up outside, and we both flinched when the lights flickered once, then twice, before everything went dark. My heart skipped, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden closeness of the situation. The only sound left was the storm and our breaths, mingling in the darkness. I fumbled for a candle on the shelf, and when I lit it, the flame threw a warm glow over her face. For a moment I forgot about the storm entirely. She looked different in that soft light, calmer, softer, almost as if the chaos outside didn't exist. She smiled at me again, a kind of quiet gratitude, and I felt something stir inside me that I hadn't been ready for. We moved into the living room together, where the shadows from the candle danced across the walls. She slipped off her wet coat and folded it carefully over the back of a chair, her movements unhurried and graceful despite the storm. I watched her more than I should have, noticing the way the flame reflected in her eyes, the way her damp shirt clung to her shoulders. I tried to look away, but it was as if the small room had shrunk and made it impossible not to notice every detail of her presence. She caught me staring once, and instead of looking away, she held my gaze for just a moment longer than necessary. It was a small thing, but it sent a wave of heat rushing through me, so strong that I had to busy myself with adjusting the candle just to distract my hands. Auntie's voice called faintly from her room, asking who was at the door, and I quickly explained that her friend had arrived. There was a pause, then a muffled reply that she would stay in bed, the storm making her joints too sore to get up. That left the two of us alone in the living room, listening to the wind rattle the windows and the rain beating on the roof. She sat on the old sofa, and after a moment, she patted the seat beside her. I hesitated, my chest tightening, but I joined her. The sofa creaked slightly under our weight, and the candlelight flickered between us. She started to talk then, her voice soft but steady, telling me how she had been visiting Auntie for years, how they had been friends since their youth, and how the storm had caught her on her way home from town. I listened, nodding at her words, but more than her stories, it was the way she spoke that held me. Each word felt like a thread pulling me closer, weaving some invisible connection between us. I found myself sharing things too, small details I hadn't meant to reveal, about how lonely it sometimes felt living in this town, about how storms always made me feel trapped, about how I'd never expected to enjoy company like this. She listened to me with the same attentiveness I had given her, and it made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt for a long time. The candle was burning low by then, and the shadows grew deeper, wrapping the room in intimacy. She shifted slightly, her arm brushing against mine, and I felt the spark of that touch linger long after. Neither of us said anything about it, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was thick, full of unspoken things, and I knew then that this night was going to change something between us. Outside, the storm roared louder than ever, but inside, it felt as if the world had slowed down, leaving only her and me in the stillness. The storm had grown worse by the time the candle burned down to a stub, the wind pressing hard against the windows as if it wanted to break inside. The house groaned under its weight, and the rain poured so heavily that it drowned out every other sound. The darkness between the flickering moments of flame felt endless, and I could sense the cold creeping in around us. She leaned back into the sofa, folding her arms for warmth, and I couldn't help but notice the way her body shivered slightly. Without thinking, I reached for the blanket draped over the armrest and offered it to her. She smiled, a soft, almost surprised expression, and instead of taking it for herself, she unfolded it and placed it across both our laps, drawing me closer without a word. The warmth that spread beneath that shared blanket was more than physical, it was something that settled inside me, like the storm outside was a world away. We sat there quietly at first, the glow of the candle wrapping us in a fragile bubble of intimacy. I tried to distract myself by tracing patterns in the fabric of the blanket, but I couldn't ignore the fact that our shoulders were touching now, our arms brushing lightly with every shift. She glanced at me once, her eyes catching mine in the dim light, and for a moment I felt completely exposed. My heart raced, thudding so loudly that I wondered if she could hear it too. I quickly looked away, pretending to adjust the candle again, but I knew she had seen the flush in my cheeks. She didn't tease, though. Instead, she leaned a little closer, her voice quieter than before, as if the storm might overhear our conversation. She told me stories from her younger years with Auntie, about how they used to sneak out during school, about their long walks by the river, about secrets they swore never to tell anyone else. There was laughter in her tone, but also a softness, a warmth that made me feel like she was sharing pieces of herself that were too precious to give to just anyone. I found myself asking questions, not because I needed to know the answers, but because I wanted her to keep speaking. I wanted to hear her voice filling the silence between the thunderclaps. She told me about her first job, how she used to work long nights in a small cafe, saving every bit she could to travel one day. She never got the chance, she admitted with a sad smile, because life had gotten in the way, responsibilities, family, expectations that weighed heavier than her own dreams. I could see something in her eyes as she said it, a quiet ache that tugged at me. I didn't know why, but I wanted to reach out and take that sadness away. Without meaning to, I confessed my own fears, that sometimes I felt like I was drifting through life, waiting for something to happen, not knowing what I truly wanted but aching for something more than the routine days I kept repeating. She listened to me with the same tender attention, nodding gently, her expression full of understanding. The storm roared suddenly, shaking the windows so hard we both jumped. She laughed softly, covering her mouth, and that sound lit something inside me. I laughed too, though my chest was still pounding from the fright, and in that shared moment of release, we looked at each other longer than before. It was as if the world outside had completely disappeared, leaving only us and the fragile glow of the candle. I realized then how close she was, her breath warm against my skin, her eyes searching mine with a question she didn't dare ask out loud. I didn't move, though. I couldn't. My body felt frozen between fear and something far stronger, a pull I couldn't name yet. The hours passed slowly, the storm showing no mercy. We talked and talked, slipping into silences that felt just as full as the words we spoke. At one point, she reached for the blanket to adjust it, and her hand brushed against mine. It wasn't an accident, not completely, and though it lasted only a second, it sent a spark through me that refused to fade. I stared down at our hands, so close now, and wondered if she felt the same. Her eyes lifted to mine again, calm but filled with something I couldn't ignore. It wasn't pity or kindness, it was recognition, as if she saw something in me that I had been too afraid to acknowledge in myself. The power never came back that night, and we stayed there, sharing stories until our voices grew hoarse and the candlelight turned the room into a place outside of time. I could feel myself changing in those hours, as though the storm wasn't just breaking branches outside, but breaking open something hidden in me too. There was a tenderness in her presence, a strength in her gaze, and a strange comfort in knowing that even if the storm lasted forever, I wouldn't mind as long as she was beside me. The storm raged through the night without mercy, and though I tried to measure the hours by the fading of the candle, time felt strange in that room. It was as if we were suspended outside of it, caught in a bubble where only the sound of rain and the soft rhythm of her breathing mattered. At some point, Auntie's voice called faintly from her room again, asking if everything was fine. I answered quickly, assuring her that we were safe, but my voice sounded distant even to myself. Because the truth was, everything inside me didn't feel fine at all. It felt like something was awakening, something I hadn't dared to name before. She shifted beside me on the sofa, pulling the blanket tighter around us both, and I felt the warmth of her thigh pressing lightly against mine. It should have been nothing, an accident of closeness, but it wasn't. Every nerve in me reacted as though it had been waiting for this kind of nearness, and I fought to keep my breath steady. We continued speaking in hushed tones, though neither of us could have explained why. Maybe it was the storm, maybe it was the house wrapped in darkness, or maybe it was just that the quiet between us carried so much weight. She told me more about her life, about mistakes she had made, about things she wished she could do over. Her words weren't bitter, though, they carried a strange kind of acceptance, as if she had learned to live with her regrets but never stopped longing for the life she could have chosen differently. I listened, every story she shared painting her in a deeper shade of human, not just Auntie's friend anymore but someone who felt real and fragile and strong all at once. And as she spoke, I found myself wanting to give her pieces of myself too. I told her things I had never told anyone, about how lonely it felt to always be the responsible one, about how I had grown used to keeping my desires hidden, about how I sometimes stared at the mirror and wondered why my reflection never looked like someone who belonged. She didn't laugh, she didn't judge, she only listened, her eyes steady on mine, as though my words had value simply because they were mine. The storm clashed again, thunder shaking the walls, and the candle sputtered dangerously low. Instinctively, I leaned closer to her, my shoulder brushing hers, and she didn't move away. Instead, she let out a soft sigh, not of discomfort but of surrender, and rested her arm loosely along the back of the sofa. It wasn't quite an embrace, but it was near enough that I felt the space between us collapsing. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in my throat. I settled for silence, letting the closeness speak louder than I could. The room smelled faintly of wax and damp wood, but beneath that, I noticed the warmth of her scent, clean and faintly floral, like something that reminded me of summer despite the storm. My heart kept tugging me toward her, and I fought against it, not because I didn't want it but because I wanted it too much. The hours stretched, and exhaustion began to creep in. My eyelids grew heavy, though I didn't want to close them, afraid the moment would vanish if I dared to sleep. But she noticed, of course she did. She touched my hand gently, just her fingertips brushing against my skin, and told me to rest. The tenderness in her voice made me ache, and before I could think twice, I let myself lean into her shoulder. She stiffened for a brief second, then relaxed, tilting her head slightly until it rested against mine. My pulse thudded wildly in my ears, yet the storm outside seemed to soften, muffled by the strange peace I felt in that position. I closed my eyes then, not quite sleeping but drifting into a space where safety and warmth existed only because she was holding it for me. When I stirred again, it was still night. The storm hadn't passed, the rain still pounded, the wind still roared. But the candle had burned itself down to nothing, and the room was darker than ever. I blinked, adjusting to the shadows, and realized I was still leaning against her. Her breathing was slow, steady, but I couldn't tell if she had truly fallen asleep. Carefully, I tried to shift, but her hand caught mine, holding it gently in the darkness. It wasn't tight, not demanding, just enough to say she didn't want me to pull away. The smallest gesture, and yet it broke something inside me. I stayed still, frozen by the warmth of her fingers tangled with mine. My chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and I wondered if she could feel the tremble in me. Minutes or hours passed, I couldn't tell. The darkness wrapped around us like another blanket, and though my thoughts raced, my body was calm, as though my place was exactly where I was meant to be. Her thumb brushed lightly across my hand once, slow, absent-minded, but deliberate enough that I knew she was awake. I wanted to ask her why, I wanted to demand what this meant, but I couldn't. My throat was too tight, my heart too full. So I stayed, letting the silence speak, letting the storm outside rage while a quieter storm built inside me. For the first time in so long, I wasn't afraid of it. The night felt endless, and yet I didn't want it to end. The storm was still screaming outside, wind rattling against the old wooden frames of the house, rain streaming like a river down the glass, but inside it felt like we were locked in our own small world. I could still feel her hand against mine, the warmth of her skin grounding me even as my thoughts spun wildly. I didn't know how long we had been sitting like that, but when I dared to glance at her, I found her eyes open in the darkness, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't pity, it wasn't casual. It was something far heavier, a gaze that seemed to see right through all the walls I had built. My instinct was to look away, but something inside me refused. I held her gaze, trembling, but also unwilling to let the moment slip away. She finally spoke, her voice quiet and steady, softer than the storm yet carrying more weight than thunder. She told me she hadn't felt this close to someone in years. Her words settled into me like a secret pressed into my palm, too delicate and too precious to drop. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but the words stuck to my tongue, afraid of breaking whatever fragile truth was hanging between us. Instead, I whispered back, telling her that I hadn't felt this scene in years either. As soon as I said it, I regretted how vulnerable it sounded, but her hand squeezed mine gently in reassurance. That small pressure undid me. It was the kind of touch that said more than 1,000 words could, the kind of touch that reminded me of all the things I had been starved of: affection, understanding, connection. The candle was gone, but our eyes had adjusted to the shadows, and the faint gray light from the storm slipping through the curtains painted her face in soft edges. I studied the curve of her lips, the way her hair fell loose over her shoulders, the tired but tender look she carried. I had noticed her before at family gatherings, but never like this. Never with the storm forcing us to share silence and warmth, never with the closeness that stripped away all the polite distance. Now, sitting beside her, I couldn't ignore the pull any longer. My heart was racing, every beat like a drum calling me closer, daring me to step into something I had only dreamed of. We began talking again, our words stumbling between long pauses, but those pauses were not empty. They were filled with something deeper, a quiet tension, an unspoken understanding that whatever was happening between us wasn't ordinary. She shared a memory of being young and restless, how she once thought she could run away and start over somewhere new, but fear had always stopped her. I admitted that I often felt the same way, craving a life that felt alive but never having the courage to chase it. Our confessions spilled out in the safety of the storm, as though the darkness invited us to show parts of ourselves we usually hid. And with every secret shared, the distance between us shrank. At one point, lightning lit up the room for a split second, washing her face in silver, and I saw something in her eyes that made me forget how to breathe. It was longing, raw and unguarded, the kind of look that stripped me bare. I didn't know if she realized how much she had revealed in that fleeting moment, but I couldn't unsee it. My body leaned instinctively closer, my shoulder brushing hers more firmly now. She didn't move away. She didn't flinch. If anything, she tilted slightly toward me, as if acknowledging the invisible pull that neither of us had dared to name. The storm grew heavier still, and the sound became a wall between us and the rest of the world. I no longer thought about Auntie in the other room, or about what this meant, or about what tomorrow would bring. All I could think about was the warmth of her hand in mine, the nearness of her body, and the terrifying, exhilarating truth that I wanted more. My lips parted, but nothing came out. Instead, I let my head rest gently against her shoulder again, my chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. I thought she might stiffen, or gently move away, but she didn't. This time, she let her arm slip fully around me, drawing me against her side with a slowness that made my breath catch. The embrace was simple, nothing more than two people sharing warmth against the storm, but to me it felt like the world was shifting. Her body was solid, steady, her hand resting lightly on my arm, and for the first time in so long, I felt safe. Truly safe. My eyes burned unexpectedly, tears threatening, not because I was sad but because I was overwhelmed by the enormity of feeling something real, something unfiltered. She must have sensed it, because she whispered softly, telling me it was okay, that I didn't have to hold everything in. The gentleness in her voice broke me open, and though I didn't sob, I let a few tears slip quietly, hidden in the darkness and the sound of the rain. We stayed like that for a long time, my head against her shoulder, her arm wrapped around me, our hands still laced together. I could feel her heartbeat when I pressed closer, strong and steady, and I wondered if she could feel mine racing in return. Nothing more happened, no sudden moves, no reckless words. But everything inside me knew that something irreversible had begun. The storm might pass, the night might end, but this connection had already carved itself into me. And I couldn't tell whether it terrified me or gave me hope. Perhaps it was both. The storm carried on through the early hours of the morning, relentless in its power, and though the house trembled and creaked with each surge of wind, I barely noticed any more. What consumed me wasn't the thunder or the flashes of lightning splitting the sky but the closeness between us, the strange and beautiful comfort of being wrapped in her warmth. We had stopped talking for a while, the silence stretching into something deeper, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound of her breathing, the rhythm of her heart faintly against my cheek, and the awareness that something fragile and extraordinary was unfolding in the small space we shared. I was afraid to move, afraid to break the spell, but I was also afraid of what it meant if I stayed. My thoughts raced, twisting and turning, yet every time I considered pulling away, her hand tightened slightly on mine, grounding me in a way words never could. Eventually she spoke, her voice low and thoughtful, carrying a weight that made me sit up just enough to meet her eyes in the dim gray light filtering through the curtains. She told me she never planned to stay so long tonight, that the storm had trapped her here by accident, and then she smiled faintly as though fate itself had arranged it. Her smile was small, but it reached her eyes, softening the tired lines there. I felt a rush of warmth that spread through my chest and into my fingertips, the kind of warmth that no blanket could ever provide. She went on, saying she hadn't expected to feel this kind of connection again, not at this point in her life. She laughed lightly, almost nervously, as if catching herself before revealing too much. But her words sank into me, a quiet confession that echoed my own unspoken feelings. I wanted to tell her that I understood, that I felt it too, but the truth caught in my throat, tangled in fear and desire. The wind shrieked again outside, and the old house rattled in protest. She shifted closer, draping the blanket more snugly around us, her fingers brushing against my arm in the process. The touch was brief, casual on the surface, but it lingered in me like a spark. I turned my head toward her, searching her face for some kind of answer, but she didn't look away. Her eyes held mine steadily, and in them I saw a mixture of gentleness and restraint, as if she was fighting the same battle I was, between holding back and giving in. I wanted to lean closer, to erase the distance that still remained, but my body froze with uncertainty. What if I misread everything? What if I broke this fragile bond before it had the chance to grow? She must have seen the conflict in me, because her voice softened, breaking the silence. She said sometimes we wait too long for the right moment, only to realize later that we've let it slip away. Her words landed heavily in my chest, each syllable sinking deeper than I expected. I whispered back, asking if she thought this was the right moment. The question hung in the air between us, trembling with vulnerability. For a heartbeat she didn't answer, just watching me with an intensity that made my breath catch. Then she reached up, tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear, her fingertips brushing against my skin with a tenderness that made my entire body shiver. She didn't lean forward, she didn't rush, but in that single touch I felt her answer. The room seemed to shrink then, the storm outside becoming nothing more than a distant backdrop to the storm inside me. My pulse quickened, my chest rising and falling unevenly, and I couldn't look away from her. I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. Slowly, almost as if afraid to scare me, she let her hand linger near my face, her thumb tracing lightly along my jaw. I closed my eyes for a moment, overwhelmed, and when I opened them again, she was still there, still watching, still waiting. The patience in her gaze undid me. I leaned forward, not much, just enough to close a sliver of the distance, and the air between us grew heavy with unspoken words. We didn't kiss. Not yet. But our foreheads brushed lightly, and that single touch felt more intimate than anything I had ever known. My breath mingled with hers, warm and unsteady, and for a moment we stayed there, suspended in the fragile space between restraint and surrender. My hands trembled in my lap, aching to reach for her, but I held them still, afraid of crossing a line too soon. She exhaled softly, a sound that felt like both relief and longing, and whispered that sometimes the universe speaks through accidents like storms. Her words carried a quiet certainty that left me speechless. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or how we would explain ourselves when the world returned with its judgments and expectations. All I knew was that here, in this storm, I was closer to something real than I had ever been. And though fear still lingered, hope began to rise louder than it. We leaned against each other again, closer now than before, and as the thunder rolled across the sky, I felt a quiet promise settle in my chest, that the storm had not trapped me, it had freed me. The night felt like it had been stitched together from endless moments of waiting, moments of closeness that pulled us towards something we both feared and wanted at the same time. The storm outside hadn't weakened, if anything, it seemed angrier than before, the wind slamming against the house, rain lashing down in heavy waves. But inside, the storm between us had grown quieter, more focused, as though all the chaos had turned inward, demanding we face what neither of us had dared to say aloud. We were still under the blanket, our bodies pressed side by side, our hands laced together as if we had forgotten how to let go. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might shake free of my chest, and I kept asking myself if she could feel it through the warmth of my skin. Her presence felt overwhelming, not in a way that frightened me but in a way that consumed me, filling up the empty corners inside me that I hadn't realized were aching. I wanted to speak, to tell her what was running through me, but every word I thought of sounded too small, too inadequate. She turned her head slightly, her forehead brushing against mine again, and in that fragile touch I felt something shatter quietly inside me. It wasn't fear anymore, it was surrender. I couldn't pretend that this was just comfort or just a storm keeping us close. There was something deeper, something I had been holding back for far too long, and it was written in the way she looked at me, as though she had been holding it too. Her voice was barely a whisper when she finally broke the silence. She said my name slowly, carefully, like she wanted to be sure I would remember it this way forever. Then she confessed that she didn't know if she was doing the right thing, but she knew she couldn't deny what she felt any longer. My breath caught at her words, my pulse thundering in my ears. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but I didn't need to. I already knew. Her hand came up again, brushing softly across my cheek, and this time I didn't hesitate. I leaned into her touch, my eyes closing, my lips parting in a trembling breath. The storm outside crashed again, thunder splitting the air, but it felt small compared to the storm inside me. When I opened my eyes, her face was so close to mine that I could see every line of worry, every flicker of hesitation, but also the deep longing she wasn't hiding anymore. My body moved on its own, closing the final inches, and when our lips met, it was not with urgency but with a gentleness that nearly broke me. It was soft, hesitant, as though both of us were afraid the moment would dissolve if we pressed too hard. But in that delicate kiss, I felt more truth than I had in all the words we had spoken. My hands trembled as I lifted them, resting one against her shoulder, needing to anchor myself to something real, because the world felt like it was tilting beneath me. She kissed me back with the same tenderness, her lips lingering against mine as if she had been waiting years for this. We pulled apart just slightly, our breaths uneven, and for a moment we simply stared at each other in the dim light. My chest ached with the weight of everything unsaid, but I knew she understood without words. Her eyes shone with something raw, something that mirrored exactly what I felt: fear, yes, but also relief and hunger and the strange, reckless freedom of finally giving in. She whispered that maybe the storm had locked us in for a reason, that maybe this was where we were meant to be all along. Her words sank deep into me, lighting up places I had kept in the dark for so long. I answered not with words but by leaning into her again, kissing her more firmly this time, letting go of the hesitation that had held me prisoner. The storm outside thundered on, but inside I felt a different kind of storm breaking, one that I didn't want to end. Our kisses deepened, each one pulling us closer, unraveling layers of restraint we had carried for too long. My body buzzed with warmth, my heart racing wildly, but underneath it all was a tenderness that kept us anchored. This wasn't reckless or careless, it was slow, deliberate, two people finally allowing themselves to be honest. Her arms wrapped around me fully now, drawing me against her, and I let myself melt into the safety of her embrace. For the first time in years, I felt whole, as though all the pieces I had been hiding had finally found where they belonged. When we finally paused, our foreheads resting together, I felt tears stinging at the corners of my eyes again. I tried to blink them away, but she noticed. She cupped my face gently, kissing my temple, and told me I didn't have to be afraid anymore. The storm could rage, the world could judge, but in this room, in this night, we had found something real. Her words made the tears fall freely, but they weren't heavy tears. They were light, cleansing, as though something inside me had finally broken open to let the truth shine through. She kissed me again, softly this time, a promise more than a question, and I let myself believe in it. The hours that followed blurred together, not in chaos but in a quiet rhythm of closeness and shared breaths. We held each other as though the world outside no longer existed, whispering fragments of thoughts, bits of truth we hadn't dared to speak before. And though I knew the storm would eventually end, I no longer dreaded it. Because even if tomorrow brought questions, complications, or regret, I would always have this night. This storm. This truth we had finally chosen to embrace. The storm had begun to ease by the time the first hints of dawn crept into the sky, but inside the house the air was still heavy, thick with everything that had happened between us. I could feel her warmth against me, the lingering taste of her lips still on mine, and the quiet rhythm of her breathing as she held me close beneath the worn blanket. The darkness had softened now into a muted gray, and faint streaks of light pressed against the edges of the curtains, but neither of us moved. We stayed wrapped in each other, our bodies unwilling to break the fragile safety that the storm had built for us. My heart still raced, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from the overwhelming truth that nothing would ever be the same again. I thought about what would happen when Auntie woke, when she came into the living room and found us like this, tangled together in a silence that said more than words ever could. The thought made my chest tighten, a mix of dread and longing. But when I shifted slightly, she noticed, and her arms pulled me closer instead of letting go. She whispered in my ear that for now, we didn't need to think about anyone else. For now, this was ours alone. Her voice was low, soothing, and it calmed the storm that had begun rising inside me again. I rested my head against her chest, listening to her heartbeat, steady and strong, and let myself believe her. But the morning light was persistent, slipping in little by little, reminding us that time was moving forward whether we were ready or not. I felt the weight of reality pressing in, the questions I knew were coming. What did this mean for us? Was this just a moment born of loneliness and storm, or was it something deeper, something we would carry with us when the skies cleared? I wanted to ask her, but the words stuck to my tongue, heavy with fear. She must have felt the tension in me, because she gently lifted my chin until our eyes met. There was no hesitation in her gaze now, no hiding, just the quiet certainty of someone who had decided to stop running from herself. She told me she didn't want to pretend last night hadn't happened, that she didn't want to go back to being just Auntie's friend who passed through. Her words made my throat tighten, and I realized how much I had been terrified she might say the opposite. Relief washed through me, warm and dizzying, and I whispered back that I didn't want to pretend either. The house was still, but every sound felt sharper now. The creak of the old beams, the dripping of rain from the roof, even the faint rustle of Auntie shifting in her bed down the hall. I thought about how fragile this peace was, how easily it could break with a single discovery, and the fear pressed at me again. But she cupped my face in her hands, her thumbs brushing lightly against my skin, and told me not to let fear ruin what we had just found. She said fear had stolen enough of her life already, and she wouldn't let it steal this. Her words struck deep, and I realized she was right. We had both spent too long hiding from ourselves, from the truth of who we were and what we wanted. This storm hadn't just trapped us together, it had forced us to face what we had both been running from. We spoke softly then, not planning, not promising forever, but sharing pieces of ourselves that felt too heavy to keep alone. She told me how often she had felt invisible, how she had learned to bury parts of herself so no one would see. I told her how many nights I had lain awake, wondering why the life everyone expected me to want felt like a cage I couldn't breathe inside. Our confessions spilled out slowly, tangled with silences that said just as much as the words. With every admission, every whispered truth, I felt the bond between us grow stronger, as though we weren't just sharing secrets but weaving them into something new, something fragile but real. The light grew stronger, painting the room in pale gold, and it made her look different, softer, almost vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. I reached out without thinking, brushing my fingers along her cheek, and she closed her eyes at the touch as though it was something she had been starved of. When she opened them again, there was a glimmer of both fear and hope in her gaze, and I knew she was thinking the same thing I was. How would we carry this into the daylight? The storm had given us cover, a secret world where only we existed, but the morning was a reminder that the real world was waiting. And yet, when she leaned forward and kissed me again, slow and deliberate, I knew that no matter how complicated it became, I didn't want to let this go. We stayed like that, kissing and holding each other in the growing light, until Auntie's voice called faintly from her room. The sound jolted us both back to reality, and for a moment panic flickered across her face. But then she steadied herself, squeezing my hand and whispering that no matter what came next, last night had been real. I nodded, my throat tight, and though fear still lingered at the edges of me, there was something stronger now, something that made me braver. Hope. The storm was ending, but in its place something new had begun, and even as the world outside prepared to intrude, I knew I would carry this with me. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a heavy stillness in the air, the kind that comes only after the sky has spent all its fury. The rain had slowed to a faint drizzle, tapping gently against the windows, and the house seemed calmer now, almost relieved. But inside me there was no calm. My heart was still tangled in everything that had happened during the night, every glance, every whispered word, every kiss that had broken me open and pieced me back together in ways I didn't know I needed. Morning light was spilling through the curtains now, soft but persistent, and it painted the room in honesty that the shadows could no longer hide. She was still beside me on the sofa, her hair tousled from the long night, her eyes searching mine as though she was trying to hold on to something before the world claimed it. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence was different now, heavier, not because it lacked meaning but because it was too full of it. I wanted to freeze time, to keep us locked in that fragile bubble where the storm had given us permission to be honest. But Auntie's footsteps creaked faintly down the hallway, and the sound made everything shift. Reality was moving toward us, and there was no way to stop it. She reached for my hand quickly, squeezing it once before letting go, as though the gesture itself was a secret promise. My chest tightened, torn between the warmth of that small touch and the ache of knowing how fragile this all was. Auntie appeared in the doorway, her hair messy, her body wrapped in her old robe, and she frowned at the sight of us huddled beneath the blanket. "You two didn't sleep at all?" she asked, her voice hoarse from rest. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, while beside me her friend answered calmly, explaining that the storm had kept us awake. Her voice was steady, smooth, betraying nothing, and I marveled at her composure. Auntie nodded, grumbling about the storm's cruelty, before heading into the kitchen to put on water for tea. The moment she left, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My companion turned to me then, her expression softer now, her eyes carrying both relief and sorrow. We followed Auntie into the kitchen eventually, trying to slip back into the ordinary rhythm of the morning. Cups clinked, spoons stirred, and polite words filled the air like a fragile cover for everything burning underneath. I felt like a stranger in my own body, going through the motions of sipping tea while my heart thudded with memories of her lips, her hands, her whispered confessions. Every time our eyes met across the table, something unspoken sparked between us, something Auntie couldn't see but that neither of us could deny. It was both exhilarating and unbearable, the weight of having a secret so heavy yet so sweet. When Auntie stepped away to fetch something from her room, the air between us changed again. She reached across the table quickly, her fingers brushing against mine, her eyes urgent. She whispered that what had happened between us wasn't just the storm, it wasn't just a passing accident. She said she had been hiding for too long, letting fear and circumstance silence her heart, and she didn't want to do that anymore. Her words hit me like lightning, shaking me to my core. My chest ached with the truth I had been holding in, and I whispered back that I didn't want to lose this, that I didn't want to go back to pretending I didn't feel what I felt. The intensity in her eyes deepened, and for a moment the room felt alive again, like the storm hadn't ended but had simply moved inside us. But then Auntie returned, and the moment collapsed back into silence. We finished breakfast in quiet, careful sentences, and when it was time for her to leave, I felt my body tense with panic. She slipped on her coat, still slightly damp from the night before, and I stood near the door, every part of me screaming to reach for her, to stop her from walking away. She smiled politely at Auntie, thanking her for the hospitality, and then her gaze flicked to me, brief but filled with all the words we couldn't speak aloud. When she stepped outside, the air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of earth washed clean by the storm. I watched her walk down the path, my heart clawing at my ribs, and I knew that if I let her go without saying something, the weight of regret would bury me alive. I rushed out after her, the drizzle soaking into my hair, my feet splashing in the wet earth. She turned, surprised, as I caught up to her, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The world was quiet now, the storm gone, the air heavy with the silence of things unsaid. I took a deep breath and told her I couldn't let this be just a night locked away in memory. I told her that everything I had felt, everything I had hidden, had become too big to bury again. My voice trembled, but I forced the words out, afraid that if I didn't, I would lose the chance forever. Her eyes softened, filling with a tenderness that undid me completely. She stepped closer, brushing her hand against mine in a gesture so small yet so full of meaning. She whispered that she had been waiting for someone to give her the courage to stop hiding, and maybe that person was me. My throat burned with emotion, my body trembling with relief and fear all at once. And there, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, we kissed again, not in secret, not in darkness, but in the open light of morning. It was gentle, certain, and it carried the weight of a promise that no storm could take away. When we finally parted, she smiled through the tears shining in her eyes, and I realized that whatever challenges waited ahead, whatever questions we would have to answer, we had already crossed the line that mattered most. We had chosen each other. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel trapped by fear or by the expectations of the world. I felt free. The storm hadn't just locked us together in the house, it had unlocked something far greater inside us both. Something we could no longer deny, something worth fighting for, no matter what came next.